In this lecture, we're going to cover a few basic points, such as what is a PC, what makes up a PC, both hardware and software. We're going to look at the main components that go into a PC. We're going to look at the standards that a PC conforms to, and we're also going to take a look at the companies that are in the most part, or for the most part, responsible for controlling a PC from both the hardware and software perspective. Most of the classes and seminars that I teach are concerning PC hardware. Now, when I start the class, I normally like to define what we're talking about. What is exactly PC hardware? What's a PC? Now, when I ask this question, a lot of people think, well, that's a pretty basic elementary question. PC stands for personal computer. While it may be true that all PCs are personal computers, I do not agree that all personal computers are PCs. A PC is actually a type of personal computer. If you take a look at it and look back in time, IBM came out with the very first PC in 1981. IBM invented the PC. It was introduced in August of 1981. Now, a lot of people get a little uptight when I mention that, and they say, oh, IBM didn't invent the personal computer. No, that's not what I said. I said they invented a type of personal computer, a style of personal computer that we today call the PC. I mean, when you go to buy software, you go to the store, you buy software mostly for either a PC or a Mac. Now, a Macintosh from Apple is a personal computer, but it's clearly not a PC. I mean, the people at the software store know that. You and I know that. So we should get a better definition of what exactly a PC is. So what is a PC? Well, some people will then say, a PC is an IBM-compatible personal computer. Well, I would have agreed with that definition years ago when IBM was in control of the PC, or what a PC is. I mean, they did invent it. And I would say from 1981, when the PC first came out, all the way up until 1987, IBM controlled what a PC was. But after 1987, the PC market took on a sort of a life of its own. IBM lost control of the very machine that they created. So a PC is a personal computer, but it has some extra attributes. Most PCs are compatible with the original series of machines that IBM developed, but IBM no longer controls the standard of what a PC is. When we talk about a PC, we can really look at it from two different angles. We could look at it from a hardware perspective or a software perspective. Let's think about the software for a second. Who today controls PC software? Now, of course, when I ask that question, very few people hesitate with the answer. They say, well, Microsoft controls PC software today. That's true. Microsoft does control the majority of the operating systems that are used on PCs, as well as even the applications. I mean, the number one word processing application is Microsoft Word for Windows, and the number one operating systems are Windows, one of the variations. Of course, it's possible to run a PC without using Windows or a Microsoft operating system, and it's also possible to run other than Microsoft software on a PC, but you have to admit they do control the majority of the market. I'd say well over 90% of the software used on PCs today, operating system and major applications, would be coming from Microsoft. Well, let's go back in time. In 1981, when the PC first came out, who controlled PC software then? Well, I would have to give the same answer, Microsoft. Now, some people would say IBM controlled PC software back then because we called it IBM PC-DOS, for example, disk operating system. But where did IBM get that DOS from? Well, they licensed it from Microsoft. In fact, in probably one of the biggest business blunders ever created, they did a license deal with Microsoft that was based on a machine-by-machine basis. Rather than buying the DOS outright, which is what they should have done, they licensed it on a machine-by-machine basis. Well, they never thought that the PC was going to sell more than 250,000 copies, and they thought that the hardware was far more important than the software. Well, we know a little bit better than that today. In fact, DOS was the cash cow that built Microsoft. It allowed them to flounder with several versions of Windows before they got one that was even reasonably usable. DOS was really what built Microsoft. And what made DOS a hit was the fact that IBM utilized it as the main operating system for their PC. So, in my opinion, and I think in most people's opinion, Microsoft has controlled PC software from the day the first PC came out back in 1981 all the way to the present. And while back then all they really had was the operating system, they had parlayed that control of the operating system into control of applications as well. I mean, years ago, the number one word processor was WordPerfect. How did Microsoft become the number one word processor with Microsoft Word? Well, when you have control over the operating system and other applications have to work with that operating system run under it, you have a little bit of an advantage. I mean, the Microsoft Word people are down the hall from the Windows people, and as it turns out, there were some certain hidden features in Windows that some of the Microsoft applications were utilizing. People from WordPerfect and other software companies, called that unfair. Well, it may be unfair, but life is tough, and that's the way it is. As it has turned out, Microsoft has parlayed their dominance of the operating system into control of many other applications. I mean, look at the web browser. They didn't create the web browser. They didn't have the most popular web browser, but now they do. And that's because they were able to bundle it in with Windows. I mean, every time a new major application comes out, a company like Microsoft, who has control of the operating system, can build that into the operating system, thus, really controlling that application. All right, well, enough about software. So we all pretty much agree that Microsoft has a lock on a lot of the software today. What about PC hardware? Who controls PC hardware? Well, if we go back to 1981, IBM controlled PC hardware. They invented the thing. Everybody basically copied IBM's PC. I mean, right down to even the shape and physical form of the unit. People copied IBM's motherboards, they copied their cases, they copied the controller cards that they used in the slots, they copied the way the disk drives worked, they copied the keyboard, the connectors, the power supply, everything. Now, the beauty of these copies were, if you had an original IBM system and your power supply failed, you could buy a cheaper, less expensive replacement from other companies that cost less than the actual IBM part, but yet it looked just like the IBM part, fit in just the same way. So, for example, if I was a power supply manufacturer, I would say, if I make my power supply look just like IBM's, there's a vast market of computers that power supply will plug into. So IBM didn't set out to create a standard. They didn't, set up a committee and say, this machine is going to be a standard. It became a standard, what we call a de facto standard. That is, just by virtue of its high volume sales and that other companies were making devices and software that worked with it, it just simply became a standard. So IBM controlled the PC. I mean, they were the ones who invented the original slots that we today call ISA slots that adapter cards plugged into. They invented all of the video standards up through VGA. I mean, I always wondered what it must have been like to work for some of the PC companies back in the early to mid-'80s like Compaq. What they would do is basically buy the newest IBM hardware, reverse engineer it, and produce their own copy of it. There was very little innovation going on. Everybody was following in IBM's coattails. Well, that changed around 1987. IBM came out with a radical new architecture in their PCs called the PS2 series of machines. And this had a different bus slot architecture, different motherboard shapes, different power supply shapes and connectors, different cases. Basically, their own new line of machines was not compatible with their previous line. Well, by that time, a huge number of other companies had been building components that were compatible with IBM's previous line, and they decided that it was too risky to try to make these components compatible with the new line as well. So everybody continued to support the classic IBM PC, XT, and AT architecture, and the market sort of took on a life of its own. Suddenly, IBM was no longer selling the most PCs. Other companies combined were selling more than IBM. They had less than half of the market. And it sort of became every company for themselves, and most were supporting the original series of PCs. So IBM kind of lost control of the very machine that they created. Well, from 1987 to the present, who then is in control of PC hardware? Well, there's a couple of ways we could look at that. One way is by sheer volume of sales. Who sells the most PCs? Well, today, all of the latest market research studies show that Dell is the #1 PC supplier, manufacturer in the world. They sell the most in the US, and they sell the most worldwide. In fact, one of the recent articles I read showed that Dell even outsold the combined Compaq and Hewlett-Packard, which are merging together, and that even with their combined forces, Dell will still outsell them. So Dell is #1 in PC sales. We have Compaq is second. We have other companies like HP, IBM, Gateway, NEC, and others sliding as we slide down the list. Well, the thing is, with a PC, there are hundreds or even thousands of companies making and selling PCs. And if you look at the whole market, if we divided it up like a pie chart, Dell's percentage is roughly about 12 to 13% of the market. And they're the biggest company selling PCs right now. So can one company controlling 12% of the market control that entire market? To me, what's more significant is when you get out of the top 10, there's about 50 to 60% of the market left. In other words, the PC is almost anarchy. There are thousands of different companies making computers that all conform to sort of a set of standards. Some are, written in stone. Other ones are sort of vague. But we call this a PC. So I would say no, Dell definitely does not control PC hardware today. Just because Dell does something to their machines doesn't mean that other companies do the same thing to theirs. And in fact, most of the bigger companies like Dell, Gateway, Micron PC, and others, they don't even manufacture most of their components. They simply purchase components off the shelf made by other companies. And that brings us to what I have here. What I have in front of me are all of the parts necessary to make a general PC. And when you look at it, it's not really that complicated. There's not really that much to a PC. I mean, we have here a motherboard, processor, I have a video card, some memory, the three main different types of drives you'll use in a PC, hard disk, floppy disk, CD-ROM or DVD drive, the power supply to run all of this stuff, and the case to put it in. There really are only, a half a dozen or so main parts that make up a PC. And the interesting thing is, I remember a couple of years ago I was teaching a class in New York City, and I happened to be in a pretty high-rise hotel. I'm riding down the elevator, some 40 or 50 stories, and people in the elevator are arguing. One was saying that Dell was better, and the other one was saying that Gateway was better. They were arguing about what was the best PC to buy or to recommend. And I was just kind of holding my mouth shut, trying not to say anything. And what I was thinking was, they're the same. You know that Dell and Gateway and most of these major vendors buy the same motherboards made by the same company. They buy the same video cards made by the same company. They buy the same hard drives, floppy drives, CD-ROM or DVD drives, power supplies. Their entire customization is having their logo put on the case. I mean, when you look at a PC as a collection of parts, they're all the same. It doesn't, I remember somebody wanted a recommendation about buying a, particular brand of personal computer, and they were worried, well, what if that company goes out of business? I don't want to buy a PC and then have that. Who cares if they went out of business? I mean, they didn't make any of the parts that went into that machine as it was. So let's just forget about the brand names and look at a PC for what it is, a collection of parts. So I have some of the parts in front of me. Now, what would be the main part that makes up a PC today? Now, when I ask that question, I usually get two different answers. Some people say, oh, it's the processor is the main part in a PC. And here I have, for example, an Intel Pentium 4 processor and heatsink. And, okay, the processor is certainly a main component of the PC. Some would say it's the main component. As an analogy, I think of using an automotive analogy, the processor in the PC is like the engine in a car. That's a pretty major component, but is it the main component? Well, let's look at what else do we have here. Well, then we come to this. This is the motherboard. I don't know. I mean, when I compare the motherboard to the processor, I'm going to have to go with the motherboard as being the main part in the PC. I mean, after all, what plugs into what here? The processor plugs into the motherboard. Which motherboard you buy decides which processor or processors you'll be able to use. Which motherboard you have dictates what type of memory you'll be using. Which motherboard you have dictates what type of video card you'll be able to use. What type of other cards you'll be able to use. What other components and peripherals will plug in. I'm going to have to say the motherboard is definitely the main component in a PC. It gives you the personality of the machine. It dictates what other devices will work with it. It dictates how fast overall the machine will perform, what processors you can use. The motherboard is definitely the main component in the PC. So in my opinion, the company that controls motherboards would be the company that controls what a PC is. Well, in looking at some sales figures for motherboards, in the late 90s, which is the last reliable figures that I have, it showed Intel outselling the next 8 competitors combined in annual motherboard sales. I've shown this as a chart to people, and they're usually incredulous. They say, no, that can't be. Wait a minute. Intel, for example, the one chart I'm thinking of showed Intel selling close to $4 billion worth of motherboards annually, and the next closest company was only selling about $800,000 worth. So with that big of a differential, most people would say, well, those numbers can't be right because Intel also sells processors and other things, and there must be other hardware involved in that figure. Let's walk over here and take a look at the screen I have up here, which shows 2001 semiconductor sales. Now this is all of the sales for these particular companies, or at least the semiconductor portions of these companies. And when we look at the top 25 semiconductor companies, as you can see, number 1 is Intel. And look at the gap between number 1 and number 2. Number 2 on this list is Toshiba. Intel is 3.5 times larger than Toshiba. Now most people, when they think of Intel, they think of their arch-rival competitor AMD, who makes the other processor that we use in PCs. Most PCs will either use Intel or AMD processors. If you look at AMD on the list here, they're 12th. In parentheses, they were 15th last year, so they've gone up a couple notches. And well, if you look at the comparative sales figures, Intel sold over 6 times the size of AMD. Well, let's take a look at this motherboard here. Let's look at it by the interfaces that are on it. These long black slots that I have on this near the edge of the board, these 2 slots, these are normally what we call ISA slots, which stands for Industry Standard Architecture, or they're also called AT bus slots, named after the IBM personal computer AT, which stood for Advanced Technology. And these were 16-bit, 8 megahertz bus slots that were created by IBM in 1981 as an 8-bit version and then revised in 1984 as a 16-bit version. So basically these slots date back to 1984. They're 1984 in their technology and in their speed, and have not changed since then, by the way. They can't make them faster as years go by, because then the cards that were designed to plug into them won't be able to keep up. Once you create a standard like this, you can't go changing it. Otherwise, companies making products and cards and things that will interface to it won't have a target to hit. We need to have a stationary target. Well, IBM, of course, invented these slots, and everybody else, merely copied them. Let's look at the other slots that are used in more modern PCs. We have 4 white slots here. These are known as PCI slots. That stands for Peripheral Component Interconnect. These were invented by Intel. Intel designed the PCI architecture and released it in 1992. Now, they didn't want to be viewed as being in control of these slots. They felt that if it remained an Intel-owned architecture, that other companies would be afraid to develop products because Intel could change the rules, midstream, giving themselves an unfair advantage. So Intel did a kind of a nice thing. They took the architecture, released it to the public, and created a committee to support it called the PCI Special Interest Group. And this committee now has, members from all different PC companies who have taken control of PCI and have evolved it from the original Intel design in 1992. So it is sort of a publicly owned standard now, but it is one that Intel did create initially. AGP is another standard created by Intel. AGP stands for Accelerated Graphics Port and is the type of interface where you plug a video card in these days. Intel designed it. Did they call up all the video card companies and ask them about the design of this architecture before they released it? No, I don't really think so. They just came out with it. They put it on their motherboards. In fact, when I first saw this, I knew that this must be Intel's way of breaking into video. They're in control of virtually all of the interfaces on the PC. Most modern PCs use USB slots on the back, Universal Serial Bus. Now, if you look at the back of this particular machine, you can see, a keyboard and mouse connector here. These are the 2 USB connectors right here. We have 2 serial ports and a parallel port. Now let's think about what we plug into these. Into the keyboard and mouse connector, well, we normally plug in a keyboard and mouse, right? Into the two serial ports here, we could normally plug in external modems was common. Things like the docking station for Palm Pilots plug in there, and older serial printers and things like that. Into the parallel port here, you normally plugged in a printer. But there were also parallel port-driven external drives like CD-ROM drives, for example, that you could plug into that. And then we come to the two USB. Question, are there mice and keyboards that will plug into USB? Yes, there are. Are there external modems and cradles for Palm Pilots and things like that that will plug into USB? Yes, there are. Are there printers that will plug into USB? Yes, there are. That means if I have USB, do I need the keyboard and mouse and serial and parallel connectors over here? No, I guess I don't. Well, and that shows another way that Intel is going to dominate the PC interface. They designed USB. It's an Intel-designed interface. Of course, now it's been released to the public in the form of a special interest group who's in control of it. But it was an interface originally created by Intel. They build this interface into all of the chipsets that they produce for their motherboard. So every Intel motherboard or motherboard using an Intel chipset has USB built in. I remember when USB came out, there was a similar interface already out called FireWire. And there was a lot of discussion, well, why do we have USB when we already had FireWire? And FireWire was faster. Well, a lot of people don't understand that this business is not controlled by what's better. I mean, Beta was better than VHS, right? But what type of VCR do you have at home? A VHS deck. That's what I thought. The thing is that it doesn't matter what's better. It matters what is more popular and what is better supported. When you go to the local Blockbuster Video and you want to rent a movie, they don't have it in Beta. They're going to have it in VHS. So by the same token, if every PC motherboard has USB on it, but virtually none of them have FireWire built in, I guess USB is going to be the better interface. And that was pretty well dictated because Intel came out with USB. Apple was the one who designed FireWire. They charge a royalty for that. Do you think Intel is going to pay a royalty to Apple to put that interface on every one of their motherboards when they can put their own interface in there for free? I don't think so. So, as you can see, there's a lot of things that go on in this industry that really aren't governed by what's better. And by the way, the latest version of USB is now actually faster than FireWire, and in some ways maybe even better. So it's the one that's the most well supported that I'm always interested in. I want the least kind of compatibility hassles and problems. I want the most support. Anyway, I'm just using this as an example to point out how a company like Intel is now in control of the industry. This motherboard shape, or form factor we call it, this is called ATX. That was created by Intel and also released to the public. So really, when you look at it from an interface point of view, from a standards point of view of form factors, connectors, interfaces, it is totally clear that Intel is the company that is really in control of what a PC is. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is, on most PCs, you see that little Intel Inside sticker on the front. Every time I see that, I kind of get a little bit of a chill runs up my spine. Yes, they are definitely in control. They are taking over from the inside out. I mean, every time I look at newer PCs, I see less and less components, fewer parts, but more of the parts that remain say Intel on them. So, take that for what it's worth, but they're definitely the architect of the PC today. Most of the other companies have to produce components that match up with the Intel components that are compatible with them or interface with them. Anyway, I hope you found this to be enlightening look at what exactly a PC is. Remember, a PC is a personal computer, but not all personal computers are PCs.